His forces now dispersed following defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompeius Magnus sailed to the island of Lesbos, where his wife, Cornelia Metella, was residing in the town of Mytilene. Traveling with her husband, Cornelia fled Italy to Greece at the onset of Rome's civil war. Instead of enjoying a comfortable life in Rome, Cornelia endured life within her husband's military camp where her safety would not depend upon Caesar's deciding to treat her honorably, while auxiliary, infantry, and cavalry units had flocked from the east to join Pompeius's legions. As his military might had grown, so too had the list of friends, with neutral senators journeying to Macedonia alongside wealthy and influential families who wanted to be seen supporting Rome's upcoming victor. After Caesar had successfully crossed from Brundisium to Epirus, and had begun making his way to Dyrrachium, Cornelia had traveled beside her husband's marching forces as they made haste to reach Dyrrachium before Caesar. However, when Marcus Antonius had landed the remainder of Caesar's forces at Nymphaeum, signaling Pompeius Magnus that battle was soon inevitable, Pompeius had said his goodbyes to Cornelia, entrusting her to the care of one of his sons as he sent her on to the town of Mytilene. Though her father, Metellus Scipio, along with Cato and Titus Labienus, were now making their way to Africa, to the province governed by Sextus Quintilius Varus, others were flocking to Lesbos to reunite with Cornelia's husband. Among them was the ex-consul, Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Crus, who had fled Pharsalus, and now arrived on the island, joining other supporters and disparate soldiers who still hadn't abandoned the fight for Rome's dying republic. Leaving the island of Lesbos with Pompeius, Cornelia sailed the coastline as her husband made efforts to recruit new legions from among his eastern allies, most of whom owed their thrones to him. But Fortuna had forsaken Pompeius Magnus following his disaster at Pharsalus. Caesar had assigned the governorship of Anatolia to Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus, who had commanded Caesar's center at Pharsalus. Calvinus, by spreading word of Caesar's victory, and by occupying the territory with Caesar's legions, had ensured that the coastline harbors would raise their chains at the approach of Pompeius's vessels, denying the vagabond general a landing. Finally at Cilicia, Pompeius was able to anchor in a small harbor where, according to the poet Lucan, there were more men upon Pompeius's ships than behind the walls of the town. At this town, referred to as Sihedra, Pompeius arranged a council with those in his company. Not only had the harbor towns along Anatolia's coast denied him access, but the Roman province of Syria also raised its chains, forcing Pompeius Magnus to consider fleeing to Parthia where he might entice King Orodes to assist in his conquest of the Roman Empire, now under the tenuous command of a rogue general. But Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Crus argued against the idea that the great Pompeius Magnus should allow himself to go begging to a king who had not yet even granted honorable burial rites for the remains of Marcus Licinius Crassus, who had died almost 5 years earlier. In Lucan's epic poem, Pharsalia, Lentulus Crus presents the Parthians as the least reliable ally Rome could seek. Rather than facing their enemy with a sword, as true men ought, they battled only from a safe distance, like cowards, launching poison-coated arrows that the wind might carry where it will. Lentulus Crus further argued that King Orodes would not be content to help Pompeius simply because the great man asked, but instead was the sort of man to demand Rome's greatest general beg on hands and knees, as well as with tears in his eyes. And what of Cornelia? Lentulus Crus pressed on. What a trophy she would be for Parthia's king. The widow of Publius Licinius Crassus, beheaded at Carrhae by the victorious forces of Parthia, and now the wife of Rome's most decorated general. How quickly would King Orodes, who valued the sanctity of marriage so little that he had 100 wives, demand that Cornelia Metella be inserted into his bed, that the eastern potentate might finalize his dominance over both Crassus and Pompeius Magnus. Lentulus Crus maintained rather, to sail for Egypt. The current Egyptian king, a youth named Ptolemy XIII Philopator, owed his throne to Pompeius Magnus, who had secured Egypt for his late father, Ptolemy Auletes, in the midst of Egypt's civil strife. Aside from that, Egypt's throne still owed Pompeius Magnus the second half of the 6 talents worth of bribe money Ptolemy Auletes had offered in 60 BC, for the Roman Senate's acknowledgement of his legal claim to Egypt's throne. As no kingdom was more pliable than when a child sat upon the throne, Pompeius's entourage continued down the coast until it reached the delta. But Egypt was in the throes of its own internal strife, which, as with the rest of the Mediterranean, was driven by Rome's civil war. Although Ptolemy Philopator was indebted to Pompeius Magnus for his throne, and was pressured by the conservative faction within his court to uphold his word, and with it, Egypt's reputation on the world stage, Ptolemy's advisor, Pothinus, favored the fortunate, which he saw in Caesar's ascending star. As regent to the underage king, Pothinus attempted to guide Egypt towards solidarity with the Caesarians. Though we know little of the detail surrounding Egypt's civil war between the young king Ptolemy Philopator and his sister wife, Cleopatra VII Philopator, it is likely that Cleopatra sided with the conservatives of her court, and supported Egypt's being true to her word by remaining loyal to Pompeius Magnus, whom Cleopatra knew personally from her years exiled in Rome with her late father. When Cleopatra sat on Egypt's throne beside her brother, auxiliary forces had been sent to Pompeius Magnus in Macedonia. However, soon after Caesar managed to slip past Bibulus's blockade, and land half his forces in Epirus, Cleopatra had been driven from Alexandria by her brother, who was controlled by Pothinus. With Cleopatra no longer sitting on the throne, Egypt had refused to send additional forces to Pompeius Magnus before the Battle of Pharsalus. And now, the ship carrying Pompeius Magnus, Cornelia Metella, and Sextus Pompeius began to anchor near Canopus, to the east of Alexandria's great harbour. Because the water was shallow, an escort soon made its way to Pompeius's ship in a small rowboat. When Pompeius attempted to step into the smaller boat, Cornelia, uneasy over the lack of pomp and ceremony usually afforded a man like Pompeius Magnus, rushed nervously to join her husband. But Pompeius Magnus refused to let her aboard. Pulling free of Cornelia's outstretched arms, Pompeius stepped into the boat, where he at once recognized a familiar face. Lucius Septimius had served as a military tribune during Pompeius Magnus's eastern campaigns against Mithridates and Tigranes the Great. Being a ranking member of the Gabiniani, Septimius had remained in Egypt on the orders of Aulus Gabinius, who had stationed the Gabiniani on the orders of Pompeius Magnus. When the boat rowed ashore, Pompeius made the acquaintance of a centurion named Salvius, as well as coming face to face with the commander of King Ptolemy Philopator's military troops, Achilles. Lucius Septimius struck first, sliding his sword into Pompeius's back, followed by Salvius, who stabbed him in the side, and Achilles, piercing from the front. As the screams of Cornelia echoed over the water, Pompeius Magnus, who uttered no sound, crumpled to the sand. Lying on the beach, laboring over his final breaths, Pompeius Magnus pulled up his toga and covered his face, preserving his dignity, even in death. As Achilles removed Pompey's signet ring, and Lucius Septimius began cutting off his head, the ship carrying the hysterical Cornelia, and Pompeius's son, Sextus, pulled up anchor, and made a hasty getaway before they too fell into the hands of the Egyptians. So ended the life of Pompeius Magnus, who, as a young man, had gathered 3 loyal legions to himself without office or title. The man who had helped Lucius Cornelius Sulla become dictator of Rome, later to be bought by Sulla with patrician brides, and used against Sulla's enemies like a weapon. The man who, after Sulla's death, had been exploited by the Metelli and other Optimati families as a tool to keep their interests secure. A man who had reached the consulship 3 times, without ever becoming a senator, or holding any lower-level magistracies, and without being elected to the office by the voting public, because it suited the agenda of those around him. A general used by Caesar to ensure the security of Caesar's radical legislation, who served as Caesar's stepping stone into the upper echelon of Roman generalship. And finally, a man manipulated by the Boni into fighting their war against Caesar, but never trusted enough to do it correctly. A general who knew how to overwhelm his enemy with superior numbers, but who lacked Caesar's resourcefulness when the conditions didn't immediately favor him. Though Pompeius Magnus, surpassing even Gaius Marius, had taught Rome what could be done with the support of loyal legions, without benefit of holding magisterial offices, he was simply never politically savvy enough to outmaneuver any opportunist who meant to use him. with his decapitated corpse tossing in the waves, and the ship bearing his son, and the widow of 2 decapitated husbands, sailing for the horizon, Achilles, Septimius, and Salvius, turned west, heading towards Alexandria. In their hands, gifts for Caesar.